I'm Karen Cappiella. I just wanted to take a second to tell you a little bit about my organization before I jump into this worksheet. If you're not familiar with the Center for Watershed Protection, we're a national nonprofit. We work on everything related to watersheds and stormwater. That includes research, direct technical assistance, training. We have a professional membership program, and we're located in Ellicott City, Maryland. So what I'm going to present today is a worksheet called the Forest Friendly Code and Ordinance Worksheet. It's published as part of this document that you see here, which is available for free download at the link shown. And I think there will be resources, the PowerPoint and other additional resources will be provided to the attendees, so don't worry about writing down the link. It'll be provided to you later. But this document here, we published it in 2018 with a generous grant from the Forest Service. So it includes a worksheet called the Forest Friendly COW, which is intended to help communities review their development regulations and identify ways to improve them so that our new site developments incorporate more trees through both conservation and tree planting. This document also has a section with resources and best practices for urban forestry programs, but today I'm primarily going to focus on the worksheet. So before I jump into the forest-friendly COW, the background on this worksheet is that it's basically a condensed version of a larger worksheet called the Code and Ordinance Worksheet, or COW. And this was something that the Center developed back in 1998 as part of our Better Site Design Manual, which was it was developed through a national consensus process. There was a roundtable that consisted of not just environmentalists, but also the development community, home builders, public works officials, transportation engineers, planners, foresters. It was a very diverse group of folks who came to consensus on a set of model development principles for site development with the goals of reducing impervious cover, conserving more natural areas, and managing stormwater runoff on development sites. And so the COW is the worksheet that communities can use to see how their development regulations measure up against those benchmarks. So it's been since 1998 since we developed the COW. So a few years ago we did an update to it, primarily because of the shift in stormwater management to these sort of larger regional stormwater ponds to more small distributed practices, green infrastructure practices throughout development sites. So that was one of the changes we made. We also just wanted to update the research behind the practices and make a better format for it. So the COW was recently updated, and then 2 years ago we worked with the Forest Service to create sort of a tailored version of it that focuses specifically on trees. So the full COW worksheet has 90-something questions, and the forest-friendly COW has 50-something. So that's just the COW, background behind the COW and its makeover. So what do we mean when we say forest-friendly development? The list here is kind of the general types of practices that we're talking about. So on a development site, we're talking about limiting the amount of clearing that happens in the first place, ordinances that require conservation of natural areas at the site, particularly around streams, promoting open space development, which is a type of development that concentrates density in one portion of the site in exchange for reduced density on another part of the site where you would have more open space and land conservation. It's also about physically protecting the trees during construction, providing incentives for both planting and conservation, and then incorporating new trees into the site by requiring tree planting and having standards in place that allow for good planting practices. It's a little easier to illustrate these things with pictures, so I just included a set of this is what we want compared to this is what we don't want. The top photo series focuses on the tree lawn, which is the area between the street and the sidewalk. On the left, you can see we have a very wide tree lawn, which is great because it allows plenty of space for planting trees that large trees to provide enough planting space for them. And it's a continuous planting strip, so the tree roots can share that planting space and create a nice canopy over the street. It can capture stormwater, provide shade, Whereas on the right, we have your typical urban tree pit, which is probably 2 by 2 feet. The tree there is probably going to end up not living very long, and or the tree roots will start to buckle the pavement and cause other utility conflicts. In the middle, we've got kind of on the left your nice canopy shaded street, which is also a reasonable width compared to the one on the right, where the development standards for that development did not require any tree planting, and the street is unnecessarily wide. And then at the bottom, we've got just illustrating good physical protection practices of trees that are going to be saved on the left, whereas on the right, they've just stockpiled materials within the tree save zone, so there will likely be impacts to those trees. So the worksheet involves reviewing local development regulations. And so this table is just an example of the types of regulations that you would look at with some examples of how each of those regulation types might promote forest-friendly development. And I guess the key point here is that some of these regulations can directly conserve forests. So a forest conservation ordinance is the perfect example. The whole intent of that is to establish forest conservation thresholds, whereas some of these other regulations will offer more indirect ways to protect forests, like the erosion and sediment control or grading ordinance. For example, it might limit clearing on steep slopes or on highly erodible soils, and those are areas where trees are likely to be growing. So that's these regulations can protect forests both directly and indirectly. So the steps for actually completing the worksheet, there's 3 of them. The first is to gather all the relevant documents to review. Step 2 is to actually review those documents and go through the worksheet, use them to answer all of the questions. And then the third is to use the results to identify where are the strengths and where are the weaknesses, and for those weaknesses, which action items you're going to move forward on. So the way that the CAL questions are worded, the question asks whether or not a particular forest-friendly practice is allowed. So the answer options include yes, which means it's either required or allowed, no, which means it's specifically prohibited, or codes are silent is the option that you would pick if the codes just don't address it at all. So it's kind of unclear whether it's allowed. And then there's some cases where a question might not be applicable. For example, if it's a highly urban community, there might be questions about open space development or types of practices that just aren't feasible in an ultra-urban area. There's also a whole section on stream buffers, and the first question is, do you have a stream buffer ordinance? And so if you don't have one, then the 10 subsequent questions would just be not applicable. So those are the 4 options. The documents that you need are going to vary depending on your community and the structure of the development regulations. Some communities might have everything contained in a single unified development ordinance or a subdivision and land development ordinance, whereas other, typically larger cities, will have a larger number of documents that need to be reviewed. But this is just examples of the kinds that we typically need to review. For the most part, you're going to be looking at municipal development regulations, but you also might need to bring in state or federal regulations as well as technical guidance manuals if those documents are incorporated by reference into the municipal codes and ordinances. So, for example, a forestry manual or a stormwater design manual might be something that you need to look at to answer some of these questions. The second step is going through the worksheet, and it contains 52 questions, and they're organized into these 9 categories, which kind of roughly correspond to the section of the code that you might find the answer in. So it's just to facilitate finding those answers. And just a couple caveats about the CAL. It is 52 questions, so it can be overwhelming. So you certainly don't have to fill out the whole thing at once. You could do it section by section or just focus on the most relevant areas. And I don't think I mentioned this before, but the CAL can be completed by municipal staff, but it could also be completed by a nonprofit or a university working in concert with the municipal staff. So the center has done this type of review for a lot of municipalities, and oftentimes we'll take the first cut at it, but then we always work with the staff to review our results and ask questions if needed. Similarly, if a municipality is taking the lead, it usually involves multiple departments taking a look at some of the questions that they're responsible for, so it can be kind of a group effort. Another caveat just is that it doesn't identify specific code language to change to. It's just a starting point for that next step, which is actually making the changes. And the Code and Ordinance worksheet, the questions really should be answers based on what's found in the code, like what's actually on the books. So it certainly might be the case that the code says one thing, but in practice something else happens. And that's really a whole other level of analysis that could also be done, but the purpose of the CAL is just to see what's actually on the books. And then the other question that we get a lot is people think that the CAL might be used to make a determination about where development's happening or where it should or shouldn't be happening. And it really doesn't. It just focuses on the site scale. It assumes that development is going to happen in your community based on the comprehensive plan and the zoning, and it just provides an opportunity for you to make improvements to influence what that development ends up looking like and its impact on the environment. So this is just one example. I wanted to throw a few of the questions up here to give you a flavor of what's in there. So for the Natural Resource Protection Regulations section, there's 5 questions. So the first one is intended to, it's based on the best practice of requiring a natural resources inventory. So if you're going to require something to be protected, it's important to first know what natural resources you have at your site, where they're located, and make some assessment about their quality so that you can protect the most sensitive or most important resources and ideally design the development around those. The next question is really just about, is there an ordinance that requires conservation of at least some portion of trees or forests, ideally some numeric minimum? And then the question 5 is really more relevant for sites, for example, formerly agricultural sites where there aren't any trees to begin with. A best practice there would be to, if the conservation thresholds can't be met, specifying that reforestation is required to get up to that threshold. And then there's a few other questions related to other natural areas like floodplains and wetlands where trees are likely to be found. So I just wanted to go through one of these questions as an example, and this is going to be using some code language from a code review we did recently for a community in North Carolina. So question number 4 is there an ordinance that requires conservation of some portion of trees or forests at development sites? So you can see this is what the worksheet looks like for each of the questions. You've got a spot to check off the answer and then a spot for notes. And most of these questions have a little bit of sort of background and sometimes references to some of the research behind the benchmarks. Not all of them, but most of them. So for this example, the code language for this particular city was found in the tree conservation ordinance. It says that the intent is to preserve tree coverage. It talks about where this actually applies, and then the specific requirements are laid out in this section here. So you can see that there's a specific minimum area of conservation required, and it varies by the zoning district. And so what you would do is, in the notes, the idea is to write down the section of the code that you found the answer in, and then provide some notes that summarizes what those requirements are. And they may often be different for different zoning districts. So the last step then is there's a page in the worksheet that allows you to, for each section of the CAL, identify what are some of the major changes that you'd like to make. And there's a lot of different ways you can go about actually making those changes and prioritizing those changes. It really just depends on the goals of the community and sort of where you are in the process of updating your codes, also things like community support for the changes. But these are some examples of how you could go about it. You could prioritize areas where you get a no question, meaning those practices are specifically prohibited. You might focus on where you might get the most bang for your buck. For example, there might be one ordinance that you've identified a lot of possible changes, so if you just update that one ordinance, that might get you pretty far. Most communities are on some sort of schedule for updating their ordinances, so you could just do it chronologically. You do want to focus on the code changes that are under municipal control. For example, depending on the political structure in your state, you may not actually have the legal authority to do some of the recommended changes, like adopting a municipal buffer ordinance. So that's another thing to consider as far as which ones to focus on first. And in Lydia's presentation, we'll get a little more into the details with examples of actually making code changes, and she's going to point to some model ordinances, for example. But the document that the Forest Friendly Cow is in has a resources section too, with some links for websites that have good examples of code language, model ordinances, and things like that. Looks like I have a couple minutes left, so that is, in addition to just introducing this tool, I wanted to give a quick example of where we've used it recently. So even though the overall purpose of it is to work with communities to improve their development regulations, it's also, in this case, we used it to see what we could learn from a research perspective about the relationship between local development regulations and what we actually see on the ground in terms of measured forest cover. So this was a project that just wrapped up in the Delaware River watershed, which includes parts of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and Delaware. It was a 3-year study funded by the Academy of Natural Sciences at Drexel, and we worked with Rutgers University and the Pinchot Institute for Conservation. So the project had 3 parts. The first was to just narrow down where we were going to work in that very large basin. The second piece, which is what I'll touch on, is using the Forest Friendly Cow to review forest protection regulations in 52 municipalities. And then the third part, which is what Rutgers was leading, was to take those results and see were there any correlations between those regulatory results and what they could measure on the ground in terms of how much forest cover was present in each municipality. So we used an early version of the Forest Friendly Cow for this, and the research question that we were focusing on was how do the forest protection regulations in the study area compare to these established benchmarks, and how do they vary from state to state or municipality to municipality or by municipality characteristics. And the results, as I said, it's not only it was more of a research study to help improve our understanding of how effective certain forest protection regulations are, but will also provide the results to nonprofits that are working in the basin and helping municipalities to improve their regulations. So this was our study area. We ended up honing in on the central portion of the Delaware watershed, and then we randomly selected 52 municipalities that had a mix of urbanization levels and political structure. So it was cities, townships, and boroughs. We did the Forest Friendly Cow review for all of those municipalities, and these are the results. Now the cow itself, the Forest Friendly Cow doesn't have a score, a numeric score, so what we did here was we said the percent of yes answers relative to all of the questions, all of the possible questions. We just showed it as a percentage so that we could compare each community to each other. So the range was 0 to 71%, and the average score was 25. And we also looked at how those scores varied across the different categories of the Forest Friendly Cow and how they varied with the percent of impervious surface in each municipality. And surprisingly, we found that the scores were higher for municipalities that had lower impervious cover, less than 10%. That was surprising to me because mostly when we've done these reviews, we've seen usually the more developed communities have stronger regulations because they've had more opportunity to, and to react to the development pressure that they've experienced, whereas typically we've seen more rural communities don't have those things in place yet because there hasn't been a need to. So that was an interesting finding. This just shows like the most communities that had the most protection for certain practices versus the least number of communities for some of these practices. And I think I'm out of time here. I only had 2 more slides, but I'll just say the basic results was that there was a lot of variation. But in general, we saw that in New Jersey seemed to have more effective regulations than Pennsylvania. Not by a lot, but just they tended to have less developed land in the stream buffer and more actual forest cover in the stream buffer compared to the municipalities in the Pennsylvania portion of the basin. And I don't want to run into Lydia's time here, so I'm going to put this back over to Philip. I think there's some poll questions, and I'll be happy to take questions at the end of the webcast. Thank you.